Under the blazing suns of Varaxis Prime, Captain Rylan Holt stood among the wreckage of a battlefield that was not his own. The air was thick with the stench of burnt metal and blood, mingling into a bitter reminder of a war he had never intended to join. Once a decorated soldier of Earth's defense corps, Rylan had retired to live in peace. Yet fate had dragged him here, a neutral observer caught in the crossfire between alien factions whose centuries-old grudges had spilled into violence. In the chaos, his eyes caught a sight that twisted his stomach. Rows of cages lined against a shattered wall, each holding alien women with chains around their necks, their eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. The merchant responsible for their captivity grinned at him through broken teeth, boasting about the price these slaves would fetch in the black markets of the Outer Rim. Rylan's fists clenched, his mind flashing back to the POW camps he had liberated during his military days. The thought of walking away churned inside him like poison. But he had no jurisdiction here, no right to interfere. Yet his conscience, worn but unyielding, whispered that walking away would damn him far more than any law could. With a grim determination, he approached the merchant and demanded a price for the captives. The alien's eyes lit with greed, mistaking Rylan's intent. The sum named was obscene, enough to drain nearly all of the savings Rylan had stored from years of service. The merchant laughed as if mocking the human's compassion. Rylan didn't flinch. He transferred the credits without a word, his hand steady even as his gut twisted. Moments later, the chains were unlocked, and the women stepped out into the dusty air, staring at him as though unsure if this was another cruel trick. Among them was a tall figure with amethyst skin and eyes like molten silver. She stepped forward, her movements regal, even in rags, and spoke in a voice low and melodic. She introduced herself as Lysara, a princess of a fallen house, captured during a raid. Her gaze lingered on Rylan, studying him as if trying to decipher why a human soldier would buy freedom for strangers. At her side was Vera, a warrior with emerald skin and sharp, calculating eyes. Neither woman thanked him outright, yet the weight of their stares carried an unspoken acknowledgement. Rylan told them they were free to go wherever they wished. Some of the women left immediately, disappearing into the winding alleys of the ruined city. But Lysara and Vera stayed, exchanging a look before stepping closer. Lysara explained that freedom was meaningless without safety. In this war-torn sector, a woman alone or even two would not survive long without protection. She offered a strange proposal. By the customs of her people, the one who frees a bonded prisoner becomes their shield-bearer, a role that often evolved into something deeper. For political safety and cultural tradition, she and Vera were bound to him now. The human soldier had heard his share of alien traditions, but this one struck him as bizarre. He tried to refuse, telling them they owed him nothing, but Lysara only shook her head. Refusal, in her culture, would be considered dishonor, even betrayal. Vera added bluntly that if he walked away, their enemies would hunt them down within days. Whether he liked it or not, they were linked by a pact older than their empires. Rylan felt the weight of the situation pressing on him. Saving lives was one thing. Becoming their permanent guardian, possibly even their mate, was another entirely. The journey away from the battlefield was tense. Rylan led the way toward his small transport, while Lysara and Vera followed close. Every step seemed watched by unseen eyes in the ruins. Shadows moved in the distance, and the hum of distant engines warned that scavengers were tracking them. Rylan's military instincts flared as he adjusted his grip on his rifle. Lysara walked with quiet grace, but Vera kept her hand near a concealed blade, her head turning at every sound. These women were not helpless, but they had chosen to follow him. That fact gnawed at his thoughts as they reached the landing pad. When they finally boarded his ship, the atmosphere shifted. The soft hum of the engines drowned out the chaos outside. Rylan plotted a course for a neutral trade hub far from the war zone, but even as the stars stretched into hyperspace, he knew this was only the beginning. Lysara and Vera exchanged words in their native tongue, their eyes occasionally flicking toward him. Rylan couldn't tell if they were discussing gratitude, strategy, or something far more dangerous. In the quiet between them, he realized something unsettling the moment he chose to save them. His life had changed forever. Rylan's ship touched down on the trade hub of Kev's station, a sprawling network of metal corridors and neon-lit markets where dozens of species mingled without care for the wars outside. The moment the ramp lowered, the smell of spiced food and burning fuel rushed in. Lysara stepped out first, her regal posture drawing curious stares from merchants and guards alike. Vera followed, scanning every corner as if expecting danger to leap from the shadows. Rylan kept his rifle slung but ready, knowing that even here, safety was more illusion than truth. The station's central bazaar was a maze of sound and color. Traders barked offers in a dozen languages. Mechanical servitors whirred past carrying crates, and the air vibrated with the thrum of distant reactors. Rylan led them toward a discreet lodging house run by an old contact from his service days. He had hoped to get them rooms, rest, and then figure out the next step. But the moment they stepped inside, the innkeeper froze, eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the alien women. His gaze lingered on their armor and scars before flicking back to Rylan with suspicion. "You're carrying trouble," the innkeeper said in a low voice, ushering them toward a private booth. Rylan explained as briefly as possible, leaving out nothing about the slave market or the purchase. The man's frown deepened. "Word's going around about a human who bought royal captives. Some see it as charity. Others think you're making a claim." Lysara's head tilted slightly, her eyes never leaving Rylan's face as the words sank in. The human soldier had not realized how quickly rumors could twist intentions into something else entirely. Vera broke the silence, her voice sharp but controlled. She reminded Rylan that by the laws of Lysara's fallen house, he was now their protector, and that title came with power as well as risk. Enemies would come for them not only to reclaim captives but to challenge his right to keep them. Rylan shook his head, insisting again that they were free, but Lysara laid a hand on his arm and said softly, "Freedom without safety is death." Her words carried a weight that silenced him before he could argue further. The innkeeper eventually gave them rooms, though his eyes followed them until they disappeared down the hall. Inside, the quarters were small but clean, with soft lighting and reinforced doors. Rylan took the room across from theirs, setting his rifle within arm's reach as he sat on the bed. He thought of returning to Earth, leaving this mess behind. But the image of the cages and the fear in their eyes haunted him. Whether by law, honor, or sheer stubbornness, he was tied to them now, and walking away felt impossible. That night, Rylan was awakened by a faint noise in the corridor. He rose silently, weapon in hand, and eased the door open. A shadow moved toward the women's room, its outline hunched and deliberate. Without hesitation, Rylan stepped forward, grabbing the figure by the shoulder and slamming them against the wall. A short, cloaked alien hissed in surprise, its hands clutching a jagged blade. Before Rylan could demand answers, Vera's door flew open, and she stepped out, blade drawn, eyes flashing in the dim light. The intruder spat a warning in a guttural tongue Rylan didn't understand, but Lysara's voice from behind Vera translated it instantly. "He says the bounty on us is worth more than this entire station." The alien twisted violently, trying to break free, but Rylan's grip was unyielding. He disarmed the attacker and tossed the weapon down the hall, forcing the alien to the ground. The station guards arrived moments later, alerted by the commotion, and dragged the intruder away without asking many questions. When the hallway was quiet again, Rylan looked at the two women. Lysara's gaze was calm, but her voice was certain. "You see now, you cannot leave us. Not here, not anywhere. Vera nodded in agreement, her tone less formal but equally firm. "You bought our freedom, human. That means you fight with us now." Rylan stood there, the hum of the station's lights filling the silence, and he realized they were right. This was no longer a simple act of rescue. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The next morning on Cavs' station began with a tense silence. Rylan had hoped for a few hours of peace, but the attack the night before had changed everything. When he stepped into the corridor, he found Vera already awake, her armor strapped. In place, her eyes scanning every passerby with suspicion. Lysara stood nearby, her posture composed yet watchful, as if expecting another attempt on their lives before the day was out. The air felt heavier, thick with the knowledge that they had been marked. They moved through the crowded market with purpose, keeping close together. Rylan's hand stayed near his rifle while Vera kept one palm resting on the hilt of her blade. Lysara, though unarmed, had a presence that seemed to part the crowd without effort. Every now and then, Rylan caught sight of figures lingering, too long in their path or ducking out of view as they passed. He was no stranger to being hunted, but having two high-profile targets at his side made the tension twice as sharp. Their destination was a weapons merchant who owed Rylan a favor from a past mission. The shop was hidden in a side corridor, its doorway half covered by a tattered banner. Inside, shelves groaned under the weight of alien weaponry, plasma rifles, shock blades, and armor pieces of every make. The merchant, a squat insectoid with sharp mandibles, greeted Rylan warmly but froze when his gaze shifted to Lysara. After a long pause, he gestured for them to follow him into the back room away from listening ears. "You shouldn't be here," the merchant warned. "Your names are being whispered in the underdeck. Credits have been offered to anyone willing to bring you in, dead or alive." Rylan absorbed the words without flinching, but his mind began mapping out escape routes in case trouble came sooner than expected. Vera looked at the merchant sharply, asking how much the bounty was. When he answered, Rylan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. It was more than enough to make betrayal tempting for anyone. They met, the merchant offered to upgrade their weapons for free, claiming it was the least he could do for an old ally. Vera accepted a new plasma-edged blade, while Rylan took a compact rifle built for close-quarters combat. Lysara declined any weapon, her eyes steady as she explained that her strength lay in command and diplomacy. Rylan didn't argue, but a part of him worried about what might happen if they were forced into a fight where words were useless. As they left the shop, a commotion in the street drew their attention. Two towering reptilian mercenaries were shoving their way through the crowd, scanning faces. One of them spotted Lysara, and a guttural shout erupted. The crowd scattered instantly, leaving the street almost empty. Rylan moved without hesitation, positioning himself between the women and the attackers, while Vera stepped forward with her new blade, gleaming under the station lights. The first mercenary lunged, its clawed hand aiming for Rylan's throat. He sidestepped and fired, the compact rifle humming as a burst of energy struck the creature's chest and sent it reeling. Vera engaged the second mercenary in a blur of movement, her strikes precise and brutal. The fight drew the attention of station guards, who arrived just as the mercenaries fell back, snarling curses and vanishing into the shadows. The guards gave Rylan a look that mixed warning and respect before moving on without questions. Once they were safely away from the scene, Lysara's voice was calm but laced with an edge. "The bounty hunters are getting bolder. We must leave this station before more arrive." Rylan agreed, but the logistics of leaving without being tracked would be difficult. Vera suggested a smuggler she knew, someone who owed her a favor, though she admitted he was not entirely trustworthy. Rylan weighed the risks, then nodded. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford, and speed was their only real ally now. The smuggler's den was hidden deep within the lower levels of Cavs' station, far from the bright markets and polished walkways above. The corridors here were dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of oil and stale recycled oxygen. Rylan walked at the front, his senses alert, while Vera kept close to Lysara, her eyes flicking toward every shadow. The further they descended, the fewer civilians they saw, replaced by rough-looking figures who eyed them with thinly veiled interest. They found the smuggler in a cramped bay cluttered with crates and engine parts. He was a wiry, scaled alien, with a permanent grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Vera," he greeted, his voice low and smooth. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again." His gaze slid over to Rylan and then to Lysara, and for a moment, something calculating passed over his face. He gestured toward a table in the corner, where a battered datapad rested beside two half-empty mugs. "You need transport," he guessed without being told. Vera confirmed it, explaining they needed to leave the station immediately and without alerting the bounty hunters. The smuggler leaned back in his chair, tapping his clawed fingers against the tabletop. "Possible," he said slowly, "but not cheap." Rylan cut in, stating they could pay but only for discretion and speed. The smuggler's grin widened, though his eyes never lost that watchful glint. Before they could settle on terms, a sharp clatter echoed from the hallway outside. Rylan's hand went to his rifle as Vera moved toward the doorway. A group of armed figures stepped into view, their leader holding a small holographic projector that displayed Lysara's face along with the bounty amount. "Looks like we found our payday," the leader sneered. The smuggler didn't move, but Rylan noticed his hand inching toward the blaster on his hip, ready to choose whichever side looked safest for him. The first shot rang out before anyone could speak. Vera was a blur of motion, closing the distance to the nearest attacker and slashing with her blade. Rylan fired over her shoulder, forcing two others back toward the door. The smuggler ducked behind a crate, swearing loudly while Lysara pressed herself against the far wall, her eyes scanning the fight for any opening. The attackers were well armed, but the narrow space worked in Rylan's favor, limiting how many could rush them at once. When the last attacker fell, the air was filled with the sharp scent of discharged weapons and scorched metal. Rylan kept his weapon raised as he scanned the corridor for any more threats. Vera wiped her blade clean, her breathing steady despite the intensity of the fight. The smuggler emerged slowly from his hiding spot, his grin now gone, replaced by a cautious expression. "Your enemies aren't wasting time," he muttered, as though the attack had somehow confirmed the value of his services. With no more patience for negotiations, Rylan demanded they leave immediately. The smuggler hesitated, then nodded, motioning for them to follow. They wound through back corridors and maintenance shafts until they reached a hidden docking bay. A small but well-armed freighter waited inside, its engines already humming. Rylan ushered Lysara aboard while Vera covered their rear. The smuggler moved to the cockpit, muttering about how quickly they needed to break orbit before word spread further. As the ship lifted off, the station fell away behind them, its metal spires disappearing into the void. Rylan allowed himself a single deep breath, but his mind remained on edge. Lysara moved to stand beside him, her voice quiet but firm. "You see now, Captain Holt, we cannot simply run forever. Those who hunt us will not stop unless they are given a reason to." Rylan didn't answer immediately, but he knew she was right. This was no longer just about escape, it was about survival on a much larger scale. The freighter's jump through hyperspace was smooth, but the tension on board was sharp enough to cut. Rylan stood in the narrow corridor outside the cockpit, listening to the steady hum of the engines. Vera sat at a small table, cleaning her blade with meticulous care, while Lysara remained near one of the viewports, watching the streaking stars. No one spoke for a long time, each lost in their own thoughts. The silence felt heavy, not with fear, but with the unspoken knowledge that the pursuit was far from over. Eventually, the smuggler's voice came from the cockpit, calling Rylan forward. He pointed to the nav display, where a blinking red marker showed their current trajectory. "We can't go to any major trade hub," he explained. "The bounty networks are too fast. By the time we dock, they'll be waiting." Rylan asked for alternatives, and the smuggler leaned back, scratching his chin before suggesting the small, unaligned moon called Drunner's Rest. It was remote, lawless, and dangerous, but it might be the only place where they could disappear for a while. Lysara entered the cockpit as they discussed it, her silver eyes narrowing at the mention of Drunner's Rest. She explained that it was known as a haven for mercenaries, exiles, and those who had nowhere else to go. In her world, it was a place spoken of in warning, not invitation. Vera joined them, crossing her arms as she said the danger might work in their favor. No one there would care who they were, as long as they didn't make enemies too quickly. Rylan considered their words carefully before agreeing to the detour. The freighter dropped out of hyperspace hours later, revealing the moon hanging like a dull silver coin against the black. Its surface was scarred with impact craters, and dotted with clusters of mismatched buildings connected by tubes and cables. As they approached, traffic control hailed them in a garbled transmission that the smuggler responded to with vague codes and false identifications. Within minutes, they were cleared to land on one of the outer pads. The moment the ramp lowered, a rush of cold, dry air swept into the ship. Drunner's Rest was as chaotic as Lysara had described. Narrow streets wound between scrap metal structures, and the air buzzed with the sound of generators and shouting voices. Rylan kept his rifle slung but visible, a silent warning to anyone considering trouble. Vera walked beside him with the Predator's alertness, while Lysara moved with regal composure despite the hostile surroundings. The smuggler led them to a low building that served as both a tavern and an inn, its sign flickering weakly in the dim light. Inside, the tavern was crowded with beings of every shape and size, each speaking in harsh tones or laughing over mugs of questionable drink. Conversations dipped briefly as the newcomers entered, eyes following them until the smuggler waved at the barkeep and motioned for a private booth. They slid into the narrow seats, and the barkeep brought a tray without being asked. The smuggler leaned forward, lowering his voice to explain that he had contacts here who might help them secure false identities and untraceable transport, but it would take time and credits. Before Rylan could respond, the door to the tavern swung open, and 3 heavily armed figures stepped inside. They were not bounty hunters in the traditional sense. Rylan could tell by their formation and the way they scanned the room that they were professionals. One of them spotted their table, and the faintest smirk crossed his face before he began walking toward them. Vera's hand moved toward her blade, but Rylan shook his head slightly, signaling for restraint until they knew the threat. The air between the two groups thickened with tension. The leader stopped at their table and addressed Lysara directly, speaking in her native tongue. Her expression shifted only slightly, but Rylan caught the flicker of recognition in her eyes. When she translated, her voice was calm but the meaning was sharp. "They are here to deliver a message," she said, "from those who claim my throne. They demand my return, and they promise death to anyone who stands in their way." Rylan met her gaze, feeling the weight of the choice pressing down harder than ever. Rylan did not look away from Lysara as the armed envoy stood over their table. The hum of the tavern seemed to fade until only the sound of his own steady breathing remained. Vera's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on her blade, but she waited for his signal. Lysara's calm expression was a mask hiding something deeper, whether it was fear, resolve, or calculation, Rylan could not yet tell. The leader of the trio repeated the demand in a sharper tone, clearly growing impatient with their silence. Rylan rose slowly, his movements deliberate. He stood just close enough to make the envoys feel his presence, but far enough to give himself room if things turned violent. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of authority honed over years in uniform. "You will leave this place," he said firmly, "and you will take your threats with you." The leader gave a cold smile, clearly unconvinced. But his eyes shifted warily to Vera, whose readiness to strike was obvious. The tension between them thickened like a drawn bow. The envoy made the mistake of stepping closer, his hand brushing the weapon at his hip. Vera moved instantly, her blade flashing as it caught the dim light. The other two envoys reacted, but Rylan was faster, drawing his compact rifle and leveling it at the leader's chest. Around them, the tavern went silent, patrons pulling back to avoid becoming collateral. The standoff held for several heartbeats before the leader raised his hand slightly, signaling his men to stand down. Without another word, they backed away toward the door. When the envoys were gone, the noise in the tavern returned in cautious murmurs. The smuggler exhaled heavily and muttered about how close they had come to bloodshed. Rylan sat back down, but his mind was already turning over what the message meant. This was not just about bounty hunters anymore. Lysara's enemies were organized, disciplined, and willing to risk coming after her even in dangerous territory. That meant they would not stop unless forced to. Later that night, in the privacy of their small rented room, Lysara explained everything. Her throne had been taken by a rival clan after her capture, and though her house had lost much of its power, there were still loyalists scattered across the stars. Her enemies feared her return, not because of her current strength, but because of what her survival represented. "If I live," she said quietly, "I am proof they have not won." Rylan understood then that protecting her was no longer a matter of choice, it was a matter of standing against tyranny. Vera leaned against the wall, her arms crossed, and added her own view. She believed their enemies would send larger forces soon, ones that could not be scared away with a single standoff. The only way to stop them was to strike first, to hit them where they least expected it. Rylan considered her words carefully. His instincts as a soldier told him she was right, but his experience also told him that any offensive move would put them all at far greater risk. Still, running forever would eventually get them killed. The smuggler entered quietly, bringing news that made the air in the room grow colder. His contacts had intercepted chatter about a strike team preparing to land on Drenner's Rest within the next 2 days. The target was clearly Lysara. He offered to help them escape again, but his voice carried doubt about whether they could outrun such relentless pursuit. Rylan looked at Lysara and Vera, reading the same conclusion in both their eyes. It was time to stop running and face the fight head-on. Rylan stood, checking the charge on his rifle and the condition of his armor. "If they're coming," he said, "we make this our ground. We end it here." Vera's grin was sharp and dangerous, while Lysara's expression was one of calm acceptance. The three of them began making preparations, turning the small inn and its surrounding streets into a defensive maze. For the first time since this began, Rylan felt a clarity that burned away the uncertainty. They would fight, and they would not break. The preparations began before the first light cycle on Drenner's Rest. Rylan and Vera worked side by side, setting up barricades in the narrow streets leading to the inn. Old scrap metal was welded into makeshift cover, while choke points were lined with concealed explosives. The smuggler provided them with a map of the surrounding area, marking every hidden alley and rooftop that could be used for an ambush. Lysara moved quietly among them, speaking with the locals who had no love for outside intruders, convincing a few to help without asking for payment. Inside the inn, Rylan organized the available weapons and ammunition into stations that could be quickly reached during the fight. Vera tested her blade with quick, precise movements, the sound of the weapon slicing through air sharp in the dim light. The smuggler, though not a fighter by nature, checked and rechecked the charges on the old turret mounted above the entrance. Lysara, standing near the doorway, observed everything with the calm focus of someone who had seen war before and understood what was about to unfold. By midday, scouts stationed on nearby rooftops reported signs of movement on the outer edge of the settlement. A transport ship, sleek and heavily armored, had landed beyond the main market. The attackers were moving in groups, advancing slowly toward the inn. Rylan tightened the straps on his armor and gave a single nod to Vera, who grinned with anticipation. The air carried a weight now, the kind that came just before the clash of steel and fire. Every sound outside seemed amplified against the stillness within. The first wave came at sunset. Shadows stretched long across the streets as armored figures emerged from the alleys, their weapons glinting in the fading light. Rylan gave the signal, and the barricades erupted in a burst of fire as the explosives were triggered. The shockwave sent debris into the air, scattering the attackers' formation. Vera leapt into the fray, her blade flashing in swift arcs, while Rylan covered her with precise bursts from his rifle. The narrow streets funneled the enemy into kill zones they had prepared hours earlier. Despite the initial success, the attackers pressed on with relentless determination. The second wave brought heavier weapons, their blasts shaking the walls of the inn. Rylan ordered a retreat inside, where they had set up stronger defensive positions. The turret above the entrance roared to life, tearing through enemy ranks, but each fallen foe seemed to be replaced by two more. Vera fought fiercely at the doorway, while Lysara directed the movement of their allies, ensuring no one was left exposed for long. A sudden crash from the rear of the building signaled trouble. A smaller team had found another route in, slipping through the back storage area. Rylan pivoted immediately, cutting down the first intruder before they could raise their weapon. The smuggler shouted a warning as more poured through, forcing them into a brutal close-quarters fight. The confined space made every strike dangerous, every movement deliberate. Vera broke away from the front to join him, her blade cutting a path through the intruders. Minutes felt like hours as the battle raged on. Smoke filled the air, mixing with the acrid smell of spent energy cells and scorched metal. Rylan's armor was scorched in several places, and a shallow cut bled across his forearm, but his focus never wavered. Lysara moved with quiet precision, pulling the wounded to safety while handing fresh ammunition to those still fighting. Outside, the streets were littered with the fallen, but the attacker showed no signs of retreating yet. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the tide shifted. The remaining attackers began pulling back, their retreat covered by a barrage of covering fire. Rylan didn't order a pursuit. He knew it was a trap to draw them out into the open. Instead, he signaled for the defenders to hold their positions until the last echo of blaster fire faded. When the smoke cleared, the streets lay silent once more. They had survived the night, but Rylan knew with absolute certainty that this had only been the beginning. The morning after the battle, Drenner's Rest felt like a different place. The streets were quieter, the usual noise of bargaining and shouting replaced by cautious whispers. Locals avoided looking directly at Rylan, Vera, and Lysara as they walked through the market, but their presence was felt everywhere. Word of their defense had spread overnight, and while some saw them as saviors, others saw them as trouble waiting to happen. Rylan could feel the weight of every gaze, wondering how many were loyal and how many were waiting to sell them out. Inside the inn, the smuggler brought news that confirmed what Rylan had already suspected. The attackers had been a test, a probing strike meant to gauge their defenses. A larger force was already on the way, one that would not simply withdraw when faced with resistance. Vera reacted with fierce determination, insisting they take the fight to the enemy before the enemy could regroup. Lysara listened silently, her hands folded, before saying that she knew where their enemy's command base was located. It was a risk, but striking first could end the hunt entirely. Rylan weighed the choice carefully. His soldier's mind told him that preemptive action was their best chance, but he also knew the cost of attacking a fortified position. Still, he could see the resolve in both women's eyes, and he understood that retreat was no longer an option. They would either end the threat here or be hunted for the rest of their lives. He nodded once, the decision made, and began outlining a plan with precise detail. The smuggler, though nervous, agreed to pilot them to the target location. Their journey took them beyond the moon's orbit, into a stretch of space cluttered with asteroid fields and drifting wrecks. Hidden within that debris was the enemy base, a heavily shielded station bristling with weapons. The smuggler brought the ship in close, using the asteroids as cover until they were within striking distance. Rylan, Vera, and Lysara prepared for boarding, each checking their weapons and armor one last time. The silence between them carried the weight of what was about to happen. The assault began with precision. Vera led the charge through the docking bay, her blade cutting through the first line of guards before they could even raise their weapons. Rylan followed close behind, his rifle firing controlled bursts that dropped enemies with ruthless efficiency. Lysara stayed in the center of their formation, her presence commanding and unshaken, directing them through the maze of corridors toward the command center. Every step forward was met with resistance, but they pressed on without hesitation. When they finally breached the command room, the leader of their enemies was waiting. Clad in ornate armor and surrounded by elite guards, he regarded Lysara with cold disdain. "You should have stayed in chains," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Rylan stepped between them, his weapon leveled, but Lysara moved forward, her gaze never leaving the man who had stolen her throne. What followed was not a negotiation, but a reckoning. As Vera and Rylan tore through the guards, while Lysara confronted the usurper face to face, the fight was brutal and swift. Rylan and Vera's combined skill left the guards fallen, while Lysara engaged the leader in a battle of speed and precision. In the end, she stood over him with his weapon at her feet, and her victory undeniable. She did not kill him but her. Words carried the weight of exile, banishing him from her realm forever. The remaining enemy forces surrendered, their will to fight broken. For the first time since her capture, Lysara stood as a ruler once more. When they returned to Drunner's Rest, the change was immediate. The threat that had loomed over them was gone, and the whispers in the streets carried a different tone: respect, even loyalty. Rylan knew he could leave now, free of any obligation. But when Lysara and Vera stood before him, their expressions made it clear they did not want him to go. "You freed us," Lysara said, her voice steady. "You fought with us. By our law. You are one of us now." And in that moment, Rylan understood he had not just freed them, he had found a place where he truly belonged.